Hello, kids, and welcome back to ECMS 7 Science. This is Mr. Smith. We're going to go over cell theory today. Obviously, I'm not Kessler Science, but the PowerPoint is provided by him, so we'll give credit there where credit is due. A couple of essential questions we're going to try to answer today is, what is the cell theory? And secondly, what are similar functions of all cells? So a cell, by definition, is the smallest structural, meaning like a structure is something that's physically there, and functional means what it does, unit of an organism. And an organism is just an accumulation of cells that make up tissues. Those tissues make organs. Those organs make up an organism. Cells themselves are usually microscopic, meaning they require typically a microscope to be able to observe them. Otherwise, they're too small to be seen with the naked eye. They contain cytoplasm and a nucleus enclosed in a membrane if we're talking about eukaryotic cells. And prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. So one of the original observers of the cell theory and started on the mission of it was Robert Hooke. Essentially, he was looking at cork cells from trees. And for those of you who don't know, cork does come from a tree. And so specifically, he's looking at the bark of a tree that's known as a cork tree. And he was looking at it under a microscope. And you can actually see that right here, what that looked like to him. And this is a picture of something like what he would have used for a microscope. And you notice there's a candle here with a mirror that's focusing light down on the specimen, and then the lenses to be able to magnify what he's looking at are within that tube there. So he thought the objects looked like individual rooms in a monastery, which were actually called cells. So Robert Hooke was actually naming what he saw after what he was familiar with. He was familiar with seeing rooms in a monastery, and those were called cells. So he said, hey, these look like our rooms, so let's call them cells. And he did not know their true function. He just knew that he saw something that, to his knowledge, had not been observed before, and that was in the year of 1665. The next person of importance to discuss in cell theory is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He developed a microscope lens to see greater magnification, much better than that of Robert Hooke. He was the first person to observe bacteria and protozoa, which are single-celled. A protozoa is a single-celled animal. Bacteria are also single-celled, but they're not animals; they're bacteria. And he observed and described red blood cells. So these are some very early on things that are happening that nobody else had seen before. And again, this was in 1670, so a long time ago. And you can see there his updates to the microscope and what had changed. So one of the main contributors to the cell theory was Matthias Schleiden. He concluded that all plant tissues are composed of cells. So looking at plants, little thin slices of plants under a microscope, he noticed that there were multiple of these what Hooke had called cells that were part of the overall structure, and basically the simplest part of the plant when he was looking at it under a microscope. So he declared that a cell is the basic building block of all plant matter. And later it would be known and considered that it's the basic building block of all life matter. He sensed the importance of the nucleus of a cell. And you notice the date is increased significantly. So the last time we were looking at Leeuwenhoek, it was in 1670. Now we're at 1838. So this is almost 200 years later. So Theodor Schwann was one of the also one of the contributors, and he actually worked with Schleiden. He concluded that all animal tissues, as I noted there in the previous slide, that animals would later be identified as being composed of cells also. So this was contributed by Theodor Schwann. Again, he did work with Schleiden, and they formed a new theory in biology called the cell theory together. And this would have been discovered in 1839. And you can see how this process of thought pattern would go. As Schleiden had looked at plants, other people were like, well, I wonder if animals are also made of these things. And thus the cell theory was given to us by Schleiden and Swan. And the two basic principles of that are all organisms are composed of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. And this theory was as important to biology as the atomic theory was to chemistry and also to physics. There was one more piece of the puzzle to the cell theory, and we're going to look at where these cells come from. So, in other words, hey, we found these cells, but where in the world did they come from? And that discovery came from Rudolf Virchow in 1855. Rudolf Virchow proposed that all cells result from the division of previously existing living cells. So, in other words, the only way you can get a cell is if it came from another living cell. They didn't just show up out of nowhere. They had to have come from another cell that was already alive. And this idea was actually the key piece of what we consider modern cell theory. And those still are the three basic underlying principles of cell theory to date. So just a quick review. There were a lot of scientific names that were brought up early on here. And we looked at Robert Hooke, and he named the cell based on observations of cork bark. And he said they looked like the little rooms in a monastery. They're called cells. Anton van Leeuwenhoek, he improved the microscope and observed bacteria and protozoa. Those are the one-celled animals. Matthias Schleiden said all plant tissues are made of cells. Theodor Schwann all said that and contributed and provided evidence that all animal tissue is also made of cells. And then Rudolf Virchow in 1855 contributed that all cells must come from pre-existing cells. So when we talk about the function of cells, meaning what they do, cells have a metabolism. So metabolism means that there are chemical reactions taking place inside the cell. Now, for humans, we think about eating and breathing and things like that, but those are both part of those metabolic processes. They have some sort of response, meaning they perceive and respond to changes in the environment. And then we look at homeostasis, which is keeping conditions inside the organism within tolerable limits, meaning they are balanced. So when you get cold, you shiver, and that causes friction because your muscle cells are twitching, and that helps you warm back up because of the friction. So that's one form of homeostasis. And one of the other things about response is if I go, ah, and just scream, some people are going to jump. That's a response to stimulus, right? So the environment changed, something in your environment changed, and therefore you had some sort of reaction. To continue our discussion of functions of cells, we also know that cells grow, organisms grow. So cells are going to increase in size especially as they're going through a reproductive process. And then reproduction takes place. Reproduction producing offspring, either sexually or asexually. Sexually meaning it takes two components, a sperm and an egg, from two different individuals. And asexually meaning it does not require those two things, and it reproduces on its own. So we also look at nutrition, which is obtaining food to provide energy for growth. And then we look at defense. And I would actually say that nutrition goes under metabolism, kind of falls under there as a subcategory. And then defense, protection against enemies. We look at our immune system. Your skin is actually the forefront of your defense against the outside world. It's also the largest organ in your body. So if you want to check for your understanding, you should answer this question. Can you recognize that according to cell theory, all organisms are composed of cells? So what are the three components of the cell theory? If you don't remember, rewind this video and look at those three slides again. Number two, recognize that cells carry on similar functions, meaning they pretty much do the same things. They reproduce, they respond to stimuli, they have genetic material within inside of them. We call that heredity. And so there are a number of things that we look at in terms of determining what characteristics are present in a functioning cell. And that's it for today. I hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions, please email them to me, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks.